All right, so I have another beginner React practice problem you can kind of do. And I will say this is something that I was actually given for a take-home interview. So I had to code this up myself with Angular and then submit it to my current company, and they had to review it. We got into an interview together. We kind of talked about the code I wrote. So this is something you might see in the wild, but it's not too difficult. So here is the thing we're going to build. It's basically a quiz where you need to prompt the user with some questions and give them some answers. They need to select on the answer that they want and then click on submit. That'll take them to the next question, and they have to keep doing this until they get through all the questions. And then finally, at the end, you show them their score. Pretty straightforward, but if you're a beginner, this might be a little bit more difficult to understand how to implement. And by the way, I'm fighting a little cold, so if my voice goes in and out, I apologize for that. So the first thing we want to do is we probably want to have an array of questions, and that questions needs to have a prompt, and then it needs to have particular answers. And then we probably also want to keep track of which answer is correct. So before you even start writing out code, I would start with the actual data model that you think we'll need to implement this. So I'll say const questions is equal to an array. And we're going to go ahead and just try to define what a single question might look like. I'll say prompt, and we'll just go ahead and say, like, what color is the sky? We'll keep this simple. And then we will say answers. And we can have this be an array of answers. So we could say like blue, green, yellow, red. So again, starting with the data model can really help understand what you need to do. And that can help guide you when you're trying to implement the actual like JSX in React. Okay, now how is someone going to know which one the correct answer is, right? So there's different ways you could do this. I'm going to go ahead and just put it here. I'll say correct answer is equal to, we'll say blue, right? Now you could potentially make these objects if you wanted to. I'll say like correct true, answer blue. But for me, I think just having the correct answer be a separate property here makes enough sense. All right, now since we're using TypeScript, what I would like to do is convert this to a type. I'll say type question is equal to basically all this data. And we're going to set this to a string. This will be a string. And this will be an array of strings. Okay. And then this is going to be an array of questions. Now, if you're not familiar with TypeScript, it's fine. All I'm saying is that like all the questions in here have to follow a certain format, have certain properties, etc. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So now what we want to do is, can we display this question to the page in React? Okay, and you should know how to do this, right? In React, you can interpolate things to the screen by doing these little curly braces. All right, so if we want to say questions 0, we could do that, and we could say prompt. And then over here, let's just go ahead and save this, make sure that we get something displayed here. What color is this guy? Now, for right now, I'm hard coding the 0, but it would be nice if when someone's clicking through the questions, we know what current index they're on, right? So this is where you have to use something like React State. Whenever you have data that's dynamically changing, and that data has to update the UI in some way, you want to probably use state. So I'm going to say current question index, and I'll say set current question index. And I'll say use state, and we will default it to 0. And then I'm going to go ahead and just use that right here. Okay, does that make sense? I'm going to go ahead and auto import this as well. Actually, I used the wrong one. Let's just do current question index. Okay, so now it's the same logic, but now we've dynamically pulled in this index, which allows us to potentially change it in the future and increment it to the next question if we were to have 3 questions or 5 questions. Now, I don't really like this approach that much because I'm going to end up copying and pasting this everywhere. So I'm going to use something called a computed value. I'll say like current question is equal to this. Okay, so now you can kind of simplify this a little bit. I'm basically just going to pull out the current question that we're on so I can use it down here in my code. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try to render out the answers. So I would potentially use checkboxes. So I think you could say input type is checkbox. And we're going to go ahead and loop over this array of answers, right? So in React, if you want to iterate over a collection, you have to use a map. So I'm going to do the curly braces. I'll say current question dot answers dot map, and we're going to pass that a callback function, which returns an input based on the answer here. Now, typically what you could do is you put a label here, and you can actually wrap this input inside of a label. And inside the label itself, you can just interpolate answer dot. Yeah, we'll just interpolate answer. All right, so now if we go to our UI, we should see we have checkboxes. And now I'm not thinking about it, we don't want to use a checkbox, we want to use a radio box. Okay, so we use a radio so we can only select one, but notice that we can select multiples. This is not working that well, right? So what we want to do is we want to give them all the same name. We'll say name is equal to answer here, and now you can only select one at a time. So a second thing we want to do is we want to probably give a button here that says submit. Okay, there we go. We got a little button. And we're going to go ahead and wrap this entire thing in a form. So it's kind of like proper HTML, right? Proper semantic HTML. All right, so if you look at what we have now, it doesn't look that great. It is not styled that well. But one tip I would give you is don't get too caught up in the look of it. Focus on the logic. Make sure you get it all working and then come back and add styling to it if you want to. I personally don't care too much about like, do you know CSS? Because it's something trivial you can go and Google. The problem solving, the logic part is like what's more important in my opinion. So what we want to do is when someone selects on one of these and submits the form, we want to check if they got the answer correct and probably keep track of that somewhere, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add on the form, I'll say on submit. We can actually keep track of when the user tries to submit this form. I'm going to do it inline here, but you can also do a function declared up here and pull it out if you want to when it gets too complicated. Now, when you submit a form, make sure you call prevent default or else the page will refresh and you'll like lose the state. See this like weird query string? If you ever see this, it's because you're submitting a form probably in React and you probably should prevent default. All right, so let's try this. I'm gonna go ahead and click on like blue and yellow, click submit. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to increment to the next question and also keep track of which one you selected. Okay, and then secondly, you'll see that there's a warning down here. Make sure that you address your warnings because they will help you out. If your code has bugs, this is probably a good thing to fix. Each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So we have a list here. We need to add a key, and I'll just say answer. We'll keep it like that. I'm just going to assume that every question has a unique answer to it. But if you're dealing with like a data model that has like a database, you probably have like unique IDs on these answers or something. But let's just refresh and make sure that error goes away. So now what we're trying to do is when they submit, we want to, first of all, check if they got the answer correct. So how do we check? The first thing we want to do is check, did they get the right answer? And then secondly, increment to the next question. Or in the game if they've finished all questions. Okay, so it's good to kind of like map out some to-dos when you're doing this so you can kind of like keep yourself aligned with a goal. Okay, so for the first one, did they get the right answer? So how do we know which one they actually selected? There's different ways you can do this. If you're using a controlled form, you probably want to keep track of which one they have checked. If you're using an uncontrolled form, you can use e.target to get the form, and then you can like dive into the JavaScript to get the actual like form data. I personally like using controlled forms, so I'm going to go ahead and say like selected answer. And then I'll say set selected answer. So we're going to go ahead and make some new state here. And we just keep track of like what answer did the user actually click. And then what we can do is on these radio buttons, we can say on change. We're going to go ahead and just call a function here. And I'll say set selected answer is equal to answer. Okay. And what this allows us to do is as they check different things on the radio, we can actually see what they selected and store that in state up here. Now, one thing I like to do just to test stuff out is you can just interpolate this out to the screen anywhere. So as they click through these, you can see that we are keeping track of what they selected. And this will allow us to have access right here to what the current answer they selected is. So I'm going to go ahead and say if selected answer is equal to current question dot correct answer. And we can go ahead and like increment some number of correct answers. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a new state here. We'll make it called score and set score. We'll set it as 0. But if they got the right answer, I'm just going to go ahead and say score plus plus, or sorry, score plus 1. And then we're going to increment to the next question if there is another question. So I'm going to go ahead and say set current question index is equal to current question index plus 1. Okay. All right, let's delete these to-dos. I think we're good. Let's also delete this interpolation we're doing. So what color is the sky? I'll click blue, and then I'll click submit. And notice that our entire application crashes. Don't be worried. If you're doing this in a live interview, just take a deep breath and try to figure out what's going on. So cannot read properties of undefined, reading prompt. You click on this, it tells you what line. So current question is undefined, which is weird because that would mean that we're accessing an invalid index from questions. So what's happening is we're incrementing this by 1 and we're going out of bounds. So what we want to do is we want to basically say const is game over, and we're going to check if the index is greater than or equal to questions.length, then we know that the game is over. So I'm going to leave this alone. Luckily JavaScript won't crash if you try to do index out of bounds. You just get it undefined. But what we're going to do is we're going to separate this into 2 different views, basically. We want to have a score screen. So if the game is over, we're going to have a score screen. Otherwise, we're going to have the current thing, the current quiz that we are playing. All right. So at some point, you can try to refactor in the smaller subcomponents if you wanted to. Like I could say function, and then I could say quiz. And then I can kind of copy and paste a majority of all this code into that, if it helps clean up your code a little bit. And I'm going to inline this just because it makes it easier. Otherwise, I have to do a lot of refactoring. And then I'm going to go ahead and just interpolate this. I'm going to go ahead and just do this. They display the quiz if the game is not over. Otherwise, we'll display a score screen. Okay. Let's make another function. We'll say function score screen. And then we'll just go ahead and say like your score is score. All right, so let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and say, what color is the sky? I'll say blue. Click submit. And it says your score is wrong. So I think this is working fine. Let's go ahead and add a couple more questions. And then also maybe we can print out how many things you got wrong. So how do we figure out how many things you got wrong? We can say like number of wrong answers. This could be like a computed, and we'll just go ahead and say questions.length minus score. Okay, it's just the opposite. For score, you got answers or questions wrong. Let's make sure this works. I'll click green. Your score is 0. You got 1 questions wrong. If I click on blue, your score is 1. You got 0 questions wrong. Cool. So let's just go ahead and add in like a couple more. You want to test out this works with real data. What is the best programming language? Correct answer. We'll say TypeScript. We'll have some options: Java, Ruby, C#, TypeScript. All right, so now let's just test this. I'm going to go ahead and click blue. I'll click submit. What is the best programming language? I know it's off my screen, but I'm going to click TypeScript and we'll click submit. Okay, your score is 2. You got 0 questions wrong. Okay, so the overall functionality is like done. You can add a bunch of little tweaks here and there. There's not really that many requirements for this project. It was basically just build a quiz. So it's kind of like, can you flex your CSS knowledge to make it look nice? Can you maybe make that score screen look a little nicer? Like maybe you want a restart button so you can kind of go back to the beginning of the quiz. Maybe you want to sort the answers and randomize them so that the users aren't prompted with the same stuff every time. There's different things you can do, but this is the overall functionality. Let's just try to align the form real quick. Just go ahead and say like last name will be like quiz form. That we're going to go ahead and say quiz form. Display flex. Flex direction is column. Gap of 10 pixels. Let's see what happens if you do this. Okay, so now the answers are on their own column, and we have the submit button down here. I might even make this 20 pixels, and then I'm also going to do the same thing here, the gap of 30 pixels. Okay, looking pretty good. And then finally, we probably want to make the form have a certain width to it. Say max width of like 600 pixels. And then we can also say margin 0 auto to center it if you wanted to. There's tons of different ways to center stuff and rearrange stuff. It's really up to you. I personally don't care about CSS, so I wouldn't mark you wrong for doing anything silly. Actually, I'm gonna get rid of the gap here. Now, before you like rush to say you're done, show whoever's interviewing you, if this is like a live interview, go through and verify everything, right? So one thing I just noticed is it takes me 2 clicks to actually have this thing be selected, which isn't that great. And it turns out, if you look at this input, I'm not binding this to any value, right? So I should basically say value is equal to, I think I can actually say checked. And then we can go ahead and say it's going to be checked if answer is equal to selected answer. Okay, so now it's going to, on the first click, it actually selects the correct thing. Okay, so a little bug, those things can kind of go unnoticed if you're not really thorough with what you're doing. But let's just go ahead and select 2 wrong answers and make sure this is still working. That's about it. I mean, I will just add in a couple of extra things just to kind of flex her knowledge. If the interviewer says, okay, can you add a button to the end of this score screen to have everything restart? Can you do that? All right, so let's just go to the score screen here, and we're going to add a button inside the fragment here. I mean, technically you could put this in like an H2 or a paragraph tag. I'll add a button that says try again. And when you click on this button, we'll just do this, call a function, and we want to reset a bunch of the state, right? We can go ahead and set the current index back to 0. We can set the selected answer back to an empty string. We can set your score back to 0. And I think that's the only state that we have. So if I do try again, it should take us back to the start, and we can keep doing the quiz, okay, until we get everything right. All right, so I'm just going to do one more thing just to kind of stress your knowledge with React. If the interviewer says, you know what, this score screen, can you write it so it's in a separate file? Just to kind of show that you know how to separate components and do like prop drilling and stuff. Let's just go ahead and make a file here called scorescreen.tsx. We're going to export that same function. But notice here we get a bunch of red squigglies because we don't know the state. We don't have access to any of that state, right? So we're going to have to pass in some things. I'll say like, I'll say total questions. Total questions is a number. Now the reason I'm doing this is sometimes you want to not pass too much information to children components. Just pass the bare minimum that you need. So instead of passing the entire array of questions here, I'm just passing in the total questions, right? Now for score, we could pass that in. That's a number. Make sure I put an S there to fix that. And now over here, the onClick, so that this component doesn't have to know about all of this internal state that was defined over here, you can actually just pass in a reset function. Okay, so I could just say this is a reset function, and it does nothing. Okay, so instead of calling this, when you click on the button, let's just call reset. And I'm going to go ahead and cut all this out. This. We're going to go back to app. We're going to delete score screen. We're going to go ahead and auto import this from the other file. And then I'll say reset is a function that does these things. And then we also want to pass in score. And then we want to pass in total questions, which is questions on length. All right, so let's test this out. Does this work? I'll say blue, say C#. You got one right, one wrong. So it's still working. And you could do the exact same thing here for this quiz component if you want to. But again, it's just, you see how there's a bunch of additional like refactoring you have to do. But you can kind of talk about presentational components and container components if you want to. So that's kind of how you do it. Again, like set up the interface of the props so that you only pass in the bare minimum that's needed to get this score screen to be displayed. And you can kind of argue why you might not even want to do this. For me, I had no problem just inlining it because I didn't see a really good, strong argument as to why we had to pull stuff out to a separate file and do all this extra work just so we can display two pieces in the DOM. But yeah, hope you guys like this. My voice is actually starting to go, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Leave a comment if you have another React challenge that you guys think that you want to see me do. I'd be willing to do that, or join my Discord and message me directly with like a link to an example practice problem. Maybe I can solve it for you all. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a good day and happy coding.